Hello, this is your brain on drugs, and this is the punk rock psychiatrist. So I went through a lot of nutrition stuff over many episodes. I tried to give you the best advice for eating healthy, long life, good mental health, etc. And I think I made a few mistakes in some of the things that I discussed, and so I just wanted to use this episode to kind of go over that, and then also to discuss like kind of how this happens and how it's so confusing. Um, so first, to kind of like let you know why why I even kind of noticed that like these mistakes may have occurred, and how they could have happened in the first place. And I think the main thing that I'm wrong about in what I've said is about saturated fat being not as bad for you as maybe people think it is. I do think it is something we need to be very careful about after doing more research. And where something like that would come from is, when I was in residency, I actually had probably one of the smartest, best psychiatrists in our department who was training us. And we got these series of, actually, a lot of my alternative medicine kind of food based nutrition lectures were based on lectures I got from this professor. And then I've enhanced them since then. And they were presenting information on seed oils and PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, not being, being potentially harmful, saturated fat not being as harmful as we thought it was, butter not being as bad as we thought it was, also cholesterol in our diet, which that one seems to actually stand. That, yeah, cholesterol in our diet, maybe that was a mistake that was made, that we thought that cholesterol in the diet was a problem. Most sources don't think that cholesterol in our diet is that big of a problem. So that was part of where I got some of this information. And so I was kind of set up from a student hearing this from someone I really respected. And I think this was also, over 10, like 15 years ago. And, there's new evidence since then. And also, a lot of the podcasts I listen to, which to me feel very evidence based, very science focused, I think they've had some guests on that are maybe not doing as good of science as I had hoped that they were. And I got a lot of information from those sources as well. So these are like, kind of boring science podcasts that, like, I think a lot of people would not find that entertaining, but I'm trying to get good information on how to do things better. And, a lot of these podcasts, they're selling some sort of product, whether it's a supplement or it's a program or it's like a tracking device or lab test, personalized medicine. you know they're doing the podcast kind of as an advertisement for something that they're um, promoting. And a lot of the time you'll have like 90%, maybe 97% of the information that they're giving is completely great information. But how are they going to sell their product if there's no evidence for their actual product, right? So if they're just giving like all this great health information and people can just take and be like, all right, great, I know what to do. Well, where does them selling some sort of product come in, right? They've got to have some sort of supplement or some sort of diet program or personalized medicine thing or some sort of tracking device, or um, some of these are selling like the continuous glucose monitors. There's not really any good evidence that those can help people that don't have diabetes regulate what they're supposed to eat. There's analyses of gut microbiome that a lot of these companies do, and they'll say, oh, you need to eat these foods to improve your gut microbiome. And it's not just general advice that everyone could take, and they're saying, oh no, for you particularly with your gut microbiome, we recommend these foods. And so they're trying to like personalize it. And I think we're moving in that direction where we can personalize things, but I don't think we're quite there yet. I think we're making progress. And you always have to be skeptical when someone's selling something. And sometimes you don't even necessarily notice it. There's not, the, I skip over when anytime I hear like the ad come in, I just skip it. I don't want to listen to that. And because a lot of the time the ad is actually from the actual podcast. They're advertising their own product, and I'm just like, no, don't care. I'm not going to buy your product. I just want your good information and listen to the scientists you have on your show. And so that, and here's the other thing is, if you're not selling some sort of product, how are you funding all your research? How are you funding all these, running the podcast and things? That takes money. Like, are you doing this out of goodness of your heart, like I am? Most people don't have the time for that, and they need to spend time making money and earning a living. Not all of us have the advantage of being able to retire early like I can, and or just trying to give something back. And also, they probably believe in their products and they see it work, and they've tried it themselves, and so they're not necessarily being dishonest. And so I think I've gotten some less than great information from some of these sources. And so in this kind of bonus episode, I wanted to go over the information that I've presented and kind of, clarify some things that I'm like, nope, I still stand by this. And then for some other stuff, say kind of like, no, I'm switching my mind on this, and this is why I'm convinced. So that's what this episode's about. So I broke it down into kind of some categories. First, intake. I still feel really, really good about fasting and intermittent fasting as something that's beneficial. I think we have pretty good information on that. I think you have to be careful with how you do it, but I do believe that fasting is useful. Now, as far as calorie restriction is concerned, and the whole calorie is not a calorie thing, I I think there's more nuance to that than maybe I presented. A calorie is kind of a calorie, but at the same time, it's not quite as straightforward. So you can go back and listen to that episode if you want to hear that. Um, it's very difficult to restrict calories, extremely difficult. Our bodies have find ways of conserving energy, and we find ways of sneaking calories that without even realizing it. And so using calorie restriction, as I have said before, is extremely difficult. I think fasting is probably one of the good ways to do it. Getting rid of ultra processed foods, eating whole foods, these are probably your best ways of doing calorie restriction. And if you're already very obese, it's going to be extremely difficult to lose that weight and keep it off. That's going to be the tough part. I think if you're using medications like GLP-1s that we're going to talk about later in this series, and then you're trying to maintain that weight that you've lost and wean off of those medications or get onto lower doses, that a lot of those techniques are going to be a lot more beneficial for you for keeping that weight off. So I stand by pretty much everything I said on intake. Now, fats, this is the big one that I want to get into. So saturated fats, I went to a lot of stuff on this. They raise cholesterol, but it's not the bad kind. It's the the large buoyant versus the small dense. I'm not convinced that there's a difference anymore between small dense and large buoyant. I think this is just not accepted that this really matters. I think when you raise cholesterol, you're raising risk for heart disease and mortality, and that's what saturated fat intake does. However, there's a lot of nuance here. And I don't know, I was just listening to actually a podcast recently, and they had the new chairman of the FDA on there, and he's talking about we're going to end the war on saturated fat. So like, if I'm being fooled, this is at like the highest levels of government, and this is like an oncologist, a surgical oncologist. This is like a doctor. This is someone who's been in administration, who's now running our FDA, right? And they're saying this, and we have this new this upside down ridiculous food pyramid thing, that's saying, oh no, it's fine to have these like saturated fats in your diet. It's the carbs you want to limit. But then you read the text, and the pyramid kind of gives a somewhat different view, but the text says a lot of the same stuff. And so if you go out there and research about saturated fat, you're going to find studies that say it increases heart disease, and you're going to find studies that say it doesn't. And there's a couple of things I've noticed. One, there is a huge study with thousands of participants in it that is often included in the ones that say saturated fat, because these are usually meta-analyses. They're collections of many studies. They're not necessarily one study by themselves. Most of the standalone studies suggest that there is a risk with saturated fat for heart disease. Um, However, there's this one that has just a giant number of participants, and if you include that in your meta-analysis, it kind of makes saturated fat not look so bad. And if you don't include it, it makes it look worse. And this study is not really a good study to include. It looks at younger folks where we're not going to necessarily have seen mortality in cardiovascular disease. They're not followed very long, so not really enough time for them to die from heart disease. And there's the numbers in the study are so high that it skews the results of the other studies. That basically it's one study out of like all the studies including the meta-analysis that skew all the rest of the numbers down to make it look like it's not a problem. That's one thing I've noticed. And so people have an agenda, and you can make data look however you want it. It's like, which study do you trust? It's really difficult. And if you don't even know how to read studies, how do you even know? And then you're listening to non-experts, you're listening to experts, and they're all giving a flurry of different opinions, and it's very confusing. So the new guidelines, I said the text is pretty much the same. They say, even though we're supposed to end our war on saturated fat, that we're supposed to have no more than 10% of our calories coming from saturated fat, which is exactly the same recommendation from past studies. And what I found is the risk of cardiovascular disease associated with saturated fat consumption follows an S curve. So think of, you've got your X and Y axis, and your X axis on the bottom is kind of like more saturated fat, more saturated fat, more saturated fat as we move to the right, and then the Y axis is the risk. Okay, so as the line goes up, we have more risk, and so an S curve, you've got a very flat line at the bottom. So like up until 10%, there's very, very minimal, if any, increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And once you hit 10%, it kind of shoots like up pretty quickly from 10 to 12%. Once you get to 12%, it flattens off again, and kind of going beyond 12% doesn't really make much of a difference. And so the curve, the line, it's kind of like an S curve, right? So up to 10%, you're pretty much good to go. Between the 10 and 12%, saturated fat as part of your, calorie consumption, is when you're vastly increasing your risk. And then once you're going over 12, your risk stays about the same. And so I think a lot of studies can look skewed because they're comparing people that are at 12. There was one study, it's like between 12 and 18%. It was like, oh, there's no difference here. And it's like, yeah, because they're both kind of, because they're both over the line. And so you're not seeing a difference here, but the 12 was already high. And so things like that can make it look like, oh, maybe it doesn't make a difference. But even the new guidelines, where we're apparently not at war with saturated fat anymore, says don't consume more than 10% of your calories of saturated fat. So that's interesting that we're just like, don't worry about this stuff, eat more beef tallow, do all this crazy stuff, but don't go over 10%. But we're going to bury that in the report so that you can't see it. The report's actually very kind of all over the place, and there's like a lot of contradictory stuff. It looks like it doesn't gel well together if you go through the whole thing. So and here's another thing that kind of skews things on saturated fat. The source of the saturated fat is also important. So fish contains saturated fat, but it also has healthy omega-3s, and these healthy omega-3s kind of balance out what the saturated fat in there is doing. And so you end up, kind of having more benefit on the total with fish because of the omega-3. And then dark chocolate is another one. The dark chocolate is the largest source of stearic acid, which is a type of saturated fatty acid, which is not associated with increasing cholesterol and cardiovascular disease and mortality. So if you eat moderate amounts of dark chocolate, and that's high in saturated fat, it's actually mostly the kind that is not harmful. Of course, if you eat tons and tons and tons of it, it has other types of saturated fat in there, and then you're eventually going to cause a problem, right? So, but if you're eating fish and dark chocolate, these are sources of saturated fat that are consistent with less risk. And then there's dairy. Interestingly, dairy has less risk, and beyond that, fermented dairy. So yogurt, kefir, which I'm always talking about, um, cheeses, those seem to have very neutral effect, despite having, a lot of saturated fat. Um, Perhaps it's because of the prebiotic, sorry, not the prebiotic, probiotics in there. Perhaps it's the protein is higher, the vitamins are more concentrated. We're not exactly sure. So it's a mixed picture, I mean, and here's a big thing. It's like focusing on individual um, things like fat and carbs and things is not really the way that you should be approaching your diet. It should be whole foods, balanced diet, variety of foods, and lowering our ultra processed foods. That's the big message. More plants is better. Fish is good, um, but of course, don't go overboard on the fish. You can go overboard on vegetables. They're fantastic. So it's a very nuanced, and I think people have difficulty with nuance. They need buzz lines, they need things that are controversial, they need to be like everything you knew was wrong and things like that. But yeah, I think I was convinced for the longest time that saturated fat was just not that much of a problem, but I now, and I don't think I was all in on saturated fat in these lectures, but I think I was hedging that it was probably not as bad as we think it is. And now I'm saying no, I would, and I've been saying, don't, limit your meat consumption. There's something going on there. Um, and there's just all kinds of other risk, right? With processed meats, and with colon cancer, and red meats, and these there's certain things in the red meats that have effects on um, mortality. And so I think, just thinking, oh, I can eat as much as this I want, and you might feel better for a while because you're getting good nutrition and energy and all these things, and muscle growth and all this, good stuff. But then long term, you're increasing your risk of heart disease, and I would recommend you don't do that. All right. So next, seed oils. So I actually changed my stance on seed oils prior to my seed oil talk. um, I had previously thought that seed oils were not a good idea, and now, and as I had said previously, I think they're great. When we've, theoretically they're pro-inflammatory, but in our body it doesn't seem to happen that way. When we look at replacing saturated fat with seed oils, we have better outcomes. And so pretty much every study is showing this, that in the real world, if you are replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fatty acids, you are going to have better outcomes, right? So, and I think one way that these seed oils get demonized or look bad in certain studies is they may not be parsing out the ultra processed foods. So ultra processed foods tend to contain seed oils and not animal fats. And the ultra processed foods are bad for us for lots of different reasons. It's not because the seed oils are in there, but when we're kind of looking, oh, this person is having a lot of seed oils. Is it the seed oils, or is it the ultra processed food that contain the seed oils that is really the problem here? And if they were just cooking with canola oil, are we going to see that same problem? And the answer is no. Okay, so I think a lot of the studies, maybe they are just kind of looking at like, what's our total consumption of this, and you're not thinking about other things, and they're not really taking that into consideration. So that is one way in which um, they actually may look worse. And then also the fact that they are pro-inflammatory, but then when we actually look in the body, they aren't. So that's like another way that we could get misled on that. I still stand by what I said on medium chain triglycerides, MCTs. Um, we don't really have enough evidence to say whether they're good or not. Um, I would probably avoid them. Um, I think it's just probably I would hedge my bets against that. Um, but a lot of people they're like, oh, these are great. I'm gonna do nothing but coconut oil and things like that. And the other thing, coconut oil is not all MCTs. It's got a lot of saturated fat in it, so I would be careful with that. I stand by dietary cholesterol does not raise cholesterol in most individuals. That I stand by, and that omega threes and monounsaturated fatty acids like olive oils and avocados oil are great. Stand by that. Next, protein. Protein's another one that I kind of changed my opinion on before I gave the lecture. There's this idea that like people are deficient in protein. Very few Americans, at least, are deficient in protein. This is like just not true. Go back and listen to my protein lecture. I stand by what I said in that. And here's the other thing: this idea of like increasing your protein, and you need more protein. It's almost impossible to do. So increasing or decreasing the amount of protein in your diet, like there's been studies where they've tried to decrease the percentage of protein and increase. Can you increase your protein? Yes, you can. But can you increase the percent of protein in your diet? That's what's hard. Because what happens when you eat more protein, you're not really substituting the fat or the carbs out. You're just adding more protein and you're adding more fats and carbs. And so you end up just eating more calories. And so it's just that they've done this with subjects where they've tried to like watch them and see increase your protein just the percent, and they just for whatever reason can't do it. It's just extremely difficult to do. And so what happens is you end up increasing calories and you're trying to increase your protein to help you not be as hungry, and you end up gaining weight because you're increasing all of your calories. Now, if you're trying to, gain muscle mass and you already have a lean body mass, increasing protein could be a good thing. But if you're trying to lose weight and you're overweight, then increasing your protein is probably not going to help you lose that weight. All right. Sodium, this is another one that this is like near and dear to my heart. I love sodium. Like I've always told people, like if there was one thing that I would not give up in my diet, no matter how bad it was for me and how likely I was to die from it, would be sodium. Because to me, you can take other things out of food, but when you take sodium out, why even eat? Like I need sodium when food is under seasoned, and people under season their food. I love to cook and I eat at people's houses, or I've had food that people make and they just don't put enough salt in it. And that's why it doesn't, that's the number one reason why it doesn't taste good. There's a lot of reasons. This is not a cooking class, but like probably the number one reason is that people are afraid of salt and they don't use enough of it. And the reason why food is better at restaurants, one reason is because they use enough salt. All right. And I've told you that, like, for most people, they're not sensitive to sodium and their blood pressure is not affected. And I've said, if that's you, then you don't really need to worry about it. But, if it does, I think it's about a third of people that like sodium can increase their blood pressure. But at the same time, it's only by like maybe 5 to 7 points. And it depends where you're sitting at. Are you at 100 over 60? Well, you could probably raise your blood pressure by 7, and you're still in a good number. Are you at like 128 over 88? And then it's like, well, okay, well, if I raise it by 7, I'm kind of in a risky zone. And so, and then if I'm in the 2/3 of people where I increase my sodium, but my blood pressure doesn't change at all, do I even need to be worried? And I've always kind of thought, nah, not really. As long as you're not like overdosing on it. However, there are studies out that show that this is not the case. Um, and the other thing is, they've also showed that like trying to lower your sodium is almost impossible to do. It's kind of like lowering or increasing your percentage of protein. Decreasing your sodium, most people just can't do it. I mean, you don't notice it. It's not like you measure these things out. You don't know how much salt is in everything you're eating. And so people try to lower it, but they end up increasing it in other places and they end up staying about the same, and it doesn't make any difference. But what they have seen is using these salt substitutes like potassium chloride instead of sodium chloride actually can help with that, and then can help lower blood pressure. There's a new study that showed that. But you do have to worry about like your body is has a bit better ability to regulate the amount of sodium in your body than it does potassium, and so you have to be careful. So I would recommend doing that under the supervision of a doctor. If you're going to switch to like having more potassium through a substitute there, you probably should be getting your potassium levels checked to make sure that they're not getting too high, because you going going too high on potassium can cause serious heart conduction issues, um, and it can certainly happen. So I would be very careful about that. But and the other thing is, I'm wondering to myself, how do I know if I'm having too much sodium? I mean, my blood pressure's fine. I don't have swelling. I don't have symptoms of, having too much sodium. But what if I'm causing damage to my blood vessels and my kidneys and all this stuff, and it's slow and I have no idea I'm doing it? And I really couldn't find much of an answer on that. But what I would say is, generally, if you're not eating out too much and you're not eating a lot of ultra processed foods which contain a lot of sodium, and you're just kind of doing your own home cooking, you're probably fine. I tend to season my food heavily because I've learned how to cook by watching professional chefs on TV for the last, I don't know, 25 years or more, almost 30 years. And so I worry that, oh, I'm seasoning like a chef seasons. I season it. I season it at every stage. I season the water. I always use lot. And seasoning means salt for the most part. Um, but using herbs, using other kinds of spices, using pepper, using chilies, using garlic, things like that, enhance flavor to the point where you may not need as much salt. And then vinegar, things like this that are really good for you, and they add flavor, because salt's not the only thing that adds flavor. And so if you're relying on all these other flavors, which I also do, perhaps I'm not putting too much salt in my food. But I do worry about that after reading this stuff. Like, my blood pressure's fine, all my numbers are fine, but am I eating too much sodium? I don't know. So I mean, that's but I am a little bit more concerned than I was before. Next, let's talk about ultra processed foods. To me, this is but the theme of the thing that I think is the worst thing for us and the biggest culprit. I think this is playing the biggest role in increasing our chronic diseases and metabolic diseases and things. It's found, um, and here's the other thing: it's found in like pretty much all diets, um, except plant-based diets. So like vegan diets could contain it, vegetarian diets could contain it, ketogenic diets can contain it. Um, so all these people, they think that they're on a healthy diet, but like Cheetos are vegetarian, and you know corn chips are vegan, and all these weird protein ultra processed food items at the store are ketogenic, right? So I think the carnivore people, they're not eating ultra processed foods, but I mean, I have huge problems with the carnivore diet. The paleo people are not eating ultra processed foods, but um, I think I think the paleo diet is unnecessary, and it's really easy to get too much saturated fat, just like with the carnivore diet. So, like, I don't think these are great diets at all. I think the keto diet is risky, but you can do it right. I think the vegan diet, the vegetarian diet are healthy diets as well. And I think a regular omnivore diet, like most people have, are also fine. And you can eliminate processed foods with all these, but it's not necessarily inherent to it. I like the plant based diet because it kind of inherently gets rid of it. And it's mostly healthy foods, or it's all healthy foods, right? So the other thing is, and I mentioned this before, that we don't know exactly what it is in ultra processed foods that are the problem. Um, some of the stuff in there is probably fine, and we're trying to figure out which ones those are, so that like we can still process foods and get the benefits from that without the poor health outcomes. I would generally try and steer clear of them if you can, as much as possible, or just decrease them as much as you can. But at the same time, if we end up learning something later on that's like, hey, this thing that we're doing with ultra processed foods is actually good for us or not a problem, um, don't think just because something's ultra processed doesn't mean that it's inherently bad for you. Um, it's almost certain that there are things about ultra processed foods that are perfectly fine, and we just don't know which is which. Okay. um, Food dye is another thing. There's a lot of talk about that now. It is likely to play an extremely small role in any kind of poor health outcomes. I think it's just an easy target and just something to make people sound like they're doing something, but like it's really, you know, should you try and avoid it? If you could take it or not take it, for the most part, I'd say don't do it. It does have benefits. It can help certain kinds of people with disabilities identify certain things about their food. Like there actually are some legitimate reasons to use food dyes, and not all food dyes necessarily. Like Europe has banned several food dyes, but not others, and so just getting rid of all of it in general is not necessarily a problem. But like I would generally say you don't need it, and if you want to avoid it, go ahead. But the thing is, the foods that it's used in are the crappy foods to begin with. And so if you're eating Fruit Loops with food dye or Fruit Loops without food dye, it really doesn't matter. It's not the food dye. If the food dye is making it look more appealing and you're more likely to eat it because that's in there, well, maybe that'll make a difference. But if you're going to eat the Fruit Loops either way, you're really not saving anything by getting rid of the food dye. And it's like healthy whole foods don't contain food dyes anyway. So do we really need to be worried about them? All right. So I talked about this theory of the weight set point and its relationship with ultra processed food causing brain damage, and your weight set point goes up. And this is not necessarily a proven theory. Um, it's a theory. It might be true. Um, we don't 100% know how these ultra processed foods are causing us to gain weight. That was the best explanation I could find. But at the same time, I've looked further into it, and it's not a done deal that that's exactly what's happening. All right. So like this body getting dysregulated and trying to get it back functioning again because it doesn't know how much it's supposed to weigh and so forth. Um, we're not really sure how this happens, and we're not really sure what to do about it. But it sounds like a good theory to me, but at the same time, it's not in stone. Um, and the things that I talked about, decreasing consumption of ultra processed food being associated with improvement in mental health, that science seems pretty clear to me. And I mean, this is a mental health podcast, so at least the thing that I say about mental health is correct. I'm trying to give good diet advice because I think patients say that, and these episodes are actually less popular than my other episodes. But people are always complaining like, oh, doctors just want to push drugs and they don't talk about lifestyle, nutrition, and all this stuff. And so I'm trying to say, hey, we actually do talk about this, and it is confusing. It's hard to talk about. We we're not as educated as we need to be on it, and the science is a lot harder to do. So I'm doing my best. And so now no one can claim that I'm a drug pusher because I have tons of episodes on lifestyle stuff. And I did my best to present it as I could with the background that I have in psychiatry. But the psychiatry stuff, I have to say, is I think I have a lot more confidence in it. But yeah, so I just wanted to make that clear. And then let's talk about carbs. This is the last one. Um, so when you look at like heart disease, I was talking about there's this whole argument with the saturated fat. Let's go back to the saturated fat as it relates to kind of carbs. So it's like they'll say, oh, it's not the saturated fat that causes the heart disease, it's the refined carbs. And here's the truth. It's actually both. All right. I think I said before, oh, it's the processed carbs. It's both. Okay. When you replace saturated fat with processed carbs, there's no change with heart disease. If you replace saturated fats with unrefined carbohydrates, you do see an improvement. With whole grains, you do see an improvement. Okay, so the processed carbs are definitely a problem, but the saturated fat is also a problem, and you should try to decrease both. And I think you've got people on one side saying, have this one and not this one, and other people are saying no, low fat, and other people are saying low carbs, and it's really decrease your unhealthy carbs, replace them with healthy carbs, with whole grains, and then replace your unhealthy fats with healthy fats, right? So more seed oils, actually, uh, instead of using these saturated fats, use the PUFAs and the MUFAs, right? Instead of these processed carbs, use these whole grains. Okay, that's what's going to help you. I think people talk that they have these like ideas on diet based around, well, I like eating this, so I'm going to promote a diet where I'm pushing this, and that's just not. It's just not the way to go. I think people are trying to justify. Oh, it's like, oh, I hate carbs and they're terrible, and I like meat, and so like I can get rid of the carbs because then I can eat I can eat all the meat I want and all this that I want, and I can eat all these like fats and saturated fats and things because I got rid of my carbs, and I like the carbs, but at least I get to eat all the bacon I want, right? And then you got other folks that are like, vegetarian or vegan, and are like, well, as long as I don't eat meat, I'm good to go. It doesn't matter if I'm eating processed foods or all this junk. As long as it doesn't have meat in it, I'm good to go. And like and oh, I'm having sugar and I'm having processed grains, and that's fine. I'm not eating meat. I'm not eating all this saturated fat, so I'm good to go. And you're both wrong, right? So you should be. It's like they want their sinful thing. It's like no one wants to just eat a balanced variety of food that's a healthy diet. Like nobody wants to do that. It's like I either want to overindulge on my carbs and sugar and things, or want to overindulge on my fats. I want to indulge in something. I don't want to just be balanced. I want to, especially Americans, they just want to be extreme. It's like, okay, I'm going to go all in on this other thing. And I just think that's a huge mistake. All right. So processed carbs and saturated fats, both a problem. All right. And let's talk, I talked a lot about the ketogenic diet. So let's talk about that. Um, when you do a ketogenic diet, like, and you say, I hedge my bets on this one. I see the good and the bad in it. Okay. So the ketogenic diet is likely about is equal to other healthy diets if saturated fats and red and processed meats are limited. Okay, so like when they've actually looked at a ketogenic diet where we're not taking in those foods, then it looks like it is about as good as other kinds of healthy diets, like a plant-based diet. However, it is much easier to eat a whole foods diet or a plant-based diet. Remember, plant-based doesn't mean no meat. It doesn't mean no fish, right? It means mostly plants. I say like 90% is usually what I'll say. Um, it's a whole foods diet that limits meat products. Okay, to me that is like a Mediterranean diet. That is a way easier diet to stick to, and they've done studies. And people have a really hard time even sticking to a regular ketogenic diet, let alone a ketogenic diet that limits saturated fats, red meats, processed meats. So if you can do that, if you like the ketogenic diet and you feel like it works for you and you're able to limit those things and you're able to stick with it for years and years and years and years, I got no problem with that. Most people that's going to be difficult. And I think if I'm going to recommend something to the masses, I would recommend not doing that because most people can't. Now, I talked about the ketogenic diet being beneficial for a lot of mental health conditions, and I think perhaps the benefit might outweigh the risk in something like schizophrenia. But at the same time, if that person can do the healthy version of the ketogenic diet, they're not having the risks associated with it, and they're potentially getting some benefits. I think for most people out there, you don't need to do the ketogenic diet. Like, it's just not. It, there's this idea that it's like going to improve all these things in your life, and there's just not a lot of evidence for that. There's some evidence for some mental health conditions. There potentially for some, if you've got some metabolic disorders. But if you don't have these issues going on and you're just thinking, oh, I'm going to have more energy, or I'm going to have more motivation, I'm going to think clearer, I'm going to live longer, I'm going to have less heart disease, but I'm not really suffering with anything right now, and I don't have things that specifically have been studied that it might help with, there's not really a good reason to go on this diet. All right. So, like, but if you do like it, you can do it, and you do prefer it, then by all means. But there are a lot of caveats and a lot of risks with it. And if you go off of it, you basically lose all the benefit that you got. All right. So that's what I would say about the ketogenic diet. That I think it's probably equal, might be helpful in certain conditions, but very difficult to stick with, and very difficult to do it without the unhealthy items that a lot of people do when they do that diet. All right. I talked a lot about fructose as well. We're talking about carbs here. Um, there's this guy out there, and he just hates fructose, and he thinks it's like the devil. And I think I bought in a little bit too much to the things that he said. I've done further research, and while fructose is not good for you, it's probably no worse than glucose. Like, this idea that it's like worse than other types of sugars is probably not true. It's probably bad just because it's found in high levels in ultra processed foods. It's got a lot of calories. It's used to replace other nutrients that we should be eating. Fructose should probably just be consumed through its being in fruit and things like that, and with the fiber, as I said before. But this kind of idea that it's like, if you switch from like a high fructose corn syrup flavored beverage to a cane sugar uh, flavor, beverage, you're not going to get. I mean, there's no real difference from a health standpoint. If you think one tastes better, but like, you probably shouldn't have either one of them. But there's no real difference between the two. This idea that, like, oh, you're better off if you go cane sugar route versus um, with something more glucose or sucrose than fructose, it's probably not going to make much difference. And then the other thing, artificial sweeteners. I was all out on artificial sweeteners. They're bad for your gut health. They actually make you hungry and make you want to eat more. I don't think so. I've looked into this a little further, and there's some new studies that have come out that have shown they're actually, when you compare artificial sweeteners with sugar, you do have more weight loss, and you do have less risk. So you aren't eating as many calories, and also the whole thing with the gut microbiome, that there's not, this could be the case, but at the same time, there's actually a paper that came out that showed that it might benefit the gut microbiome. Now, would I recommend not having artificial sweeteners? Yes. Like, what? But if you're choosing, if it's like sugar or artificial sweetener, and you're gonna have one or the other, go with the artificial sweetener. If you have to have something in your coffee or whatever, and you don't think artificial sweeteners taste like garbage like I do, um, I'm going to use sugar if I'm going to use something. I tend to not use either one, but if I'm going to use one, I'm going to use sugar, just because, like, I hate the taste of artificial sweeteners. To me, they don't satisfy what I'm looking for with sweetness at all. Like, I just don't, they don't taste like sugar. They don't give the effect. So for me, I don't really have a problem with having too much sugar. So if I'm going to use some sugar every once in a while, I'm going to go with real sugar. I think if you're having it on a regular basis and you can't cut down on your sugar, but you can, if you replace with artificial sweeteners, you should do so. All right. I think if you can eliminate both, or have minimal amounts of each, that probably is gonna be your best bet. All right. So what's the bottom line here? There's a lot of healthy diets. You have to pick kind of what's right for you. And the healthy diets have some things in common. They all include limiting ultra processed foods, limiting saturated fat, and limiting red and processed meats. Those are the things that I think are the most and when I say processed meats, that's an ultra processed food. So, but I just added on there. Um, Red meats, I would keep to a minimum. Maybe one serving a week at most. Saturated fat, you want to stay under that 10% of calories per day. But and if you're in the best way to get your saturated fat would be through like fermented dairy, dark chocolate, and fish. And then consuming as minimal amount of ultra processed foods as possible. I think if you can do those things, and then also and then fiber is another thing. So we want to limit ultra processed foods, saturated fat to below the 10%, and red processed meats. And we want to have more plants and fiber. And so I think if you do those things, then you're going to improve your cardiovascular outcomes, your mortality outcomes, which is like how long you're going to live, and your mental health outcomes. And so you pick the diet that works best for you, that kind of fits within those guidelines, and that could be lots of different types of diet, right? So just decreasing ultra processed foods, saturated fat, red processed meats, and increasing plants and fiber, right? And whatever that diet is, that's that's a fine diet, but you need to pick something. It's kind of like a fitness routine. You need to pick something that works for you, that you can stick with. If you're going to do something that's very restrictive and you don't like it, but it gives you the outcome that you want, and then you're going to just quit it and do what you were doing before, then it's kind of a waste of your time. It's like a fitness routine. If you're just going to work out for a couple of months and then stop, then it's probably a waste of your time. You need to find something you enjoy. Find a diet within those guidelines, kind of within those very, very small amount of things that I'm saying that you need to do, that works for you. And that could be a ketogenic diet. It could be just a low carb diet that's not ketogenic. It could be a vegan diet. It could be a vegetarian diet. It could be a regular omnivore diet. It could be plant-based diet. Um, it could be lots of, it would not be a carnivore diet. It would probably not be a paleo diet. It would not be this, anti-lectin diet, whatever that's called. Um, it it would not be these kind of extreme or restrictive things. Um, but just find what you would enjoy most in food that kind of follows that pattern, and you're going to get your best heart and brain function, and that's what we're all about, right? And so then also, the last point I want to make with my bottom line is, it's easy to be fooled with those, but with an agenda. And it's like, I'm a victim of this as well. That's why I'm doing this episode today. Um, it's often hard to know that they have an agenda, and then you look and you see everyone seems to have an agenda. You know, are they selling something? Are they profiting from this? Or are they just feeding their ego? Or do they have some sort of ideology, that they are attached to? Like, a lot of vegans, for example, they're just very anti-killing of animals. And I think that's a good thing, but I also think that we've eaten meat for the whole history of humankind, and that it can be done well. And to just demonize everything and everyone that does that is not really helping the argument. And having these kind of extreme viewpoints is just, it's not helping society. Um, so I'm generally not in favor of any kind of extreme viewpoint. I think you need to take a balanced approach to everything. And if you want to have that kind of lifestyle, go for it, but don't push it on other people, that are doing their best and doing something that is perfectly fine. All right, so I would be if I would look out for people that are selling supplements. Supplements, for the most part, are complete junk unless you are like actually deficient in something. And people that say you need these supplements all the time, and that their supplements are better than everyone else's supplements, and they've tested theirs and they're better absorbed, and all this nonsense. You know, if you need supplements, there is cheap there are cheap ones that are easily available at the store. You don't need to buy the ones that are 3 times the price that some influencer is selling you on. This person is just a salesperson, and they may be dressing up their speech with 95% awesome information, and then they've got a little bit of disinformation in there, just enough to sell their product. And it's like, can you listen to them and get all that good information and then just be like, but I'm not going to buy their product because that part of what they're saying is nonsense? It's hard to do. um, and you want to get that good information, and maybe you find this to be a source that's fun to listen to and so forth. But I would be wary of that, because I think anyone that's selling supplements you should be suspicious of. Anyone that's saying that you need some sort of scan, those spec scans, for example, that you need some sort of special lab. Oh no, we're not measuring enough um, blood markers and things, and you need a full body MRI, and you need all these labs. And we've tested this stuff, and what we've found is, if you test too many things, and you often find things that lead you nowhere and just end up in the long run causing harm. We end up having to biopsy things that are not a problem, and there's risk with that. There's cost to the healthcare system with that. um, there's just there's no benefit to it. So, like, I would be looking, what is the AMA saying? What is the American Academy of Family Medicine saying? What is the American Academy of Pediatrics saying? And what is ACOG saying? What is the APA saying? Like, what are the why does this one person have some sort of truth that no one else has? Everyone is in some sort of conspiracy against whatever, doing some lab or scan. Like, wouldn't they make money off of it if they promoted it as well? Why are they trying to keep this from you? And essentially, you've got some sort of you've got a charismatic storyteller that's convincing you of this. And be wary of charismatic storytellers. These are salesmen. These are the same people that are lawyers, that are selling cars and all these other unscrupulous things. People that are hawking supplements and scans and special labs. To me, they're con artists, and they know how to tell a story. They know how to convince you. So these are people that I'd be very careful about listening to what they have to say. And then people that are just ideological, that they just, like, they believe this is the one and only truth. These are other people I would be very weary of as well. Other things I would be careful of: people that are promoting like a very restrictive diet. So, like I said above, if you can follow these things, and I think it's not restrictive to say don't eat ultra processed foods, because ultra processed foods are kind of not, they're like lab created things that, like, probably shouldn't exist, but we created them with good intentions, to help make more food and to preserve food to feed more people, and so that people wouldn't be hungry, and so that things will last longer, and things like that. So at the same time, I'm not against all ultra processed foods. I'm against your entire diet being an ultra processed food. If you want to have a scoop of ice cream, or a slice of cheesecake, or a cookie, or a muffin, or whatever it is, a donut, at the end of your day, and you can limit yourself to just one, and the rest of your diet is all good, healthy food, then I would encourage that. But some people, it's like with alcohol, they have one and then they have to have 10. But some people, they can have one and not have another one for another month. And I would not discourage that kind of drinking at all. I think it can be socially beneficial, to have the occasional drink where you're out with people, and it makes it easier to have the social thing going on. But if you're the kind of person that can't do that, you should probably not have it. Same thing with these ultra processed foods. If you can limit it and just have it like as a dessert, then go for it. Right. So I think anyone who's saying absolutely don't have this at all, do I eat bacon sometimes? Yeah, I eat bacon probably like, I don't know, 5 or 6 times a year. So like, am I completely eliminating processed meats? No, I'm not. And I don't think that eating bacon a couple times a year is going to cause cancer or whatever it does. I think if you eat it every day for breakfast, then you're putting yourself at risk, right? You're having bacon and eggs every day, probably not the best thing to do. But if you have a burger a few times a year and you like a bacon burger, then have the bacon on there. If you can do without and you don't need it, then go without it. But if you want the bacon on there and you rarely have it, why not? Right? So that's what I'd say. People that are saying like you can never have these things and you can't eat any plants and you can't eat any meat or whatever, but at the same time, if that's you and you want to just eat plants, I think that's perfectly fine, right? Um, and so that would be the other thing. People promoting highly restrictive diets, and then the lectin thing, like saying, "Oh, you can't have any lectins," and there's all these foods that are on this list, and diets like that, where it's like, "Oh, you can't eat all these things because they have this component in them that I think is bad, but like is not proven." And then I would be aware of people just stating absolutes about diets for everyone, like everyone must do this, and this is the reason why our society is like this. I mean, I would say the if I'm going to make an absolute statement, I would say the problem is that we have way too many ultra processed foods in our diet. And it's 60% in America, it's 60% of an adult's diet, and it's 70% of children's diets. That is way too much. It should be like 2 or 3%, right? Like 5%. I don't know what the number is, but 60 and 70%, that's the problem. So if you want the one absolute I will say for everyone is your diet should not consist of 60 to 70% ultra processed foods. It should be as close to zero as you can get it. Um, that is the one thing. But when they're saying absolutes about all these other things, that should raise your eyebrows. All right. So, and then, I mean, I mentioned like the scans, the labs. Sometimes it's like the tracking devices, the Fitbits or the sleep monitors or the continuous glucose monitors. There's all kinds of things that people sell. The personalized health plans. Um, if you follow a few simple rules, you don't need all this. You don't need to buy a product. Just follow the few simple rules. Limit ultra processed foods, saturated fats, red processed meats, eat more plants, which have fiber, and you should be pretty good to go. In fact, you'll be way better off than you were before you did that. And no one's perfect. So I just, I wanted to do this episode because I think I really kind of messed up on saturated fat the most. And there's a few things, the artificial sweeteners, I've calmed down on that. The fructose, I've calmed down on that. And I just wanted to kind of give you as an example that like I will change my mind. I am influenced by the truth and facts, and I try to go in that direction. And I'm not ideological about this stuff. And that when you get more information, you change your mind, and that's a good thing. And I've changed my mind on some things, and I'll probably change my mind in the future. And so hopefully I've changed your mind on some things, and you're reconsidering some of the things that you've thought or done or eaten. And maybe you were looking for guidance on how to do these things better, and this has helped you. And I also, I wanted to show that like we do talk about lifestyle medicine in medicine. All right. So I hope you enjoyed this special episode I had today. I hope you'll join me for the next one, and I'll see you then.